The snow had been falling since early morning, the kind of heavy, wet snow that bends the branches of the old spruce trees in the backyard, the ones my wife Dorothy planted when our kids were still small enough to catch snowflakes on their tongues. I stood at the kitchen window, watching those branches bow under the weight, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and I thought, this is the most alone I have ever been in 64 years of living. We buried Dorothy 3 days before that snow. Cremated, actually that was what she wanted. She'd written it all down in a little green notebook she kept in her nightstand, along with what song she wanted played and who she did not want giving a eulogy. She was specific like that. Precise. I used to tease her about it. Now I would give anything to find another one of her lists, tucked somewhere I hadn't looked yet. The service was at the United Church on Elm Street, the one we've been going to for 30 years. The pews were full. Dorothy had taught elementary school for 26 years in this town, and half the adults sitting in those pews had once been 7 years old in her classroom. She remembered every single one of them. She kept the photo album just for former students. That was the kind of woman she was. My son-in-law, Dennis, was the one who suggested we have the reading of the will the very next week. My daughter, Cheryl, our only child, called me on a Sunday evening, and the conversation started normally enough, asking how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, and then, almost like she was reading from a script, she said that Dennis thought it would be cleaner to sort out the estate while everything was still fresh. I remember pressing the phone against my ear and not saying anything for a long moment. "Dad, you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Dennis just thinks the longer you wait, the more complicated these things get. He's looked into it." I wondered when Dennis had found the time to look into it. The funeral reception had barely ended. Dorothy's sister was still in town, sleeping in the guest room down the hall. "I'll call the lawyer," I said. "We'll set something up." I didn't sleep that night. Not because of grief, though there was plenty of that. I lay in the dark thinking about Dennis, about the way he'd stood at the reception, near the food table, talking to a man I didn't recognize, about how he'd looked over once and caught me watching him, and how he hadn't looked away, just held my gaze for a beat too long before turning back to his conversation. I had known for some time that Dennis was not who Cheryl believed him to be. A father notices things. The way he spoke over her at dinner, the way she checked his face before she answered any question I directed at her. Small things, the kind of small things that accumulate over years into something that is no longer small at all. Dorothy had noticed too. She never said it plainly, that wasn't her way. But a few months before her diagnosis she had mentioned, casually, over breakfast, that she'd called Cheryl at her office and Cheryl had said she couldn't talk, that Dennis was home. It was a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I put down my fork. "What does that mean?" I'd asked. Dorothy had looked at her tea. "I don't know," she said. "I just don't know." The lawyer's name was Hugh Brennan. We'd used him for years, drafted our wills with him back in 2009, updated them again in 2018. He had an office on King Street above a dental practice, and the waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines. When I walked in on the Wednesday morning for the meeting, Dennis and Cheryl were already there. Dennis was wearing a suit. I noticed that immediately. A dark gray suit on a Wednesday morning to sit in a law office above a dentist for a meeting that had been described to me as just going over the paperwork. Cheryl was beside him in a beige sweater, her hands folded in her lap, and she gave me a small smile when I came in, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. We went into Hugh's office together. Hugh shook my hand, said he was very sorry about Dorothy, and I believed him. He had known her a little, through me, through the occasional charity event. He poured water from a pitcher on his desk and set a glass in front of each of us. Dennis uncrossed and recrossed his legs. He glanced at his watch. Hugh began by going through the straightforward parts. The house, our house, the one we'd owned on Birchwood Drive for 28 years, was in both names, which meant it transferred to me outright. Dorothy's RRSP account, which he had named me as beneficiary on, would roll over. Her small jewelry collection was to be divided, as she'd specified in a letter attached to the will. Dennis leaned forward. "And the rental properties?" Hugh glanced at him, then at me. "We'll get to that." I watched Dennis settle back. He'd adjusted his cufflink. Dorothy and I had purchased 2 rental properties over the years, a small duplex in the East End that we'd bought in 1999, and a single-family house in the West End that we picked up in 2011. Both had been put into a corporation years ago on advice from our accountant for tax purposes. The corporation held the properties. Dorothy and I each held shares. Dorothy's shares in the corporation, Hugh said, looking at his papers, were transferred into the family trust in 2021. Dennis's head came up. I'm sorry, the trust? The Henderson Family Trust, Hugh said. He turned a document on his desk so it faced us. Dorothy made this change in July of 2021 with my assistance. The trust holds your shares, and the trust document specifies the terms under which those shares are managed and ultimately distributed. I wrapped both hands around my water glass. What does that mean, practically? Dennis asked. His voice was carefully even. It means those shares don't pass directly through the will. They're governed by the trust. The trustee has discretionary authority over the assets. And who is the trustee? Hugh looked at me. Your father-in-law. The silence in the room had a texture to it. I could hear the faint sound of a drill from the dental office below. Cheryl turned to look at me. Her expression was unreadable. Dennis said, So he controls everything. The trust controls the assets. Your father-in-law administers the trust, yes. Can it be challenged? Hugh said evenly. Trusts of this type, properly structured and executed, are quite durable under Ontario and federal law. Your wife could speak with her own counsel if she had questions. Dennis stood up. He didn't say anything. He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, put it on with careful, deliberate movements, and walked out of the office. The door clicked shut behind him. Cheryl didn't move for a moment. Then she pressed her lips together and looked at the window. Cheryl, I said. Not now, Dad. Sweetheart. I said not now. She picked up her purse and followed her husband. I sat there with Hugh in the quiet office. He refilled my water glass without being asked. She knew, I said. Dorothy knew this was coming. Hugh nodded slightly. She was thorough, he said. She wanted to make sure things were in order. I looked at the document on his desk. Dorothy's signature was at the bottom, and her handwriting, neat and looped, the same signature she put on birthday cards and school permission slips for 3 decades. I put my finger on it, just briefly, and then I took it away. I drove home the long way, up along the lake shore, past the park where Dorothy and I used to bring Cheryl on summer evenings when she was small. There were geese on the ice at the edge of the lake, standing around looking unbothered by the cold. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a while with the engine running. I thought about the summer of 2021. Dorothy had been diagnosed in the spring stage 3 breast cancer, which the oncologist described with careful optimism as very treatable. She'd gone through surgery and then chemotherapy. I'd driven her to every appointment. We'd sat in a treatment center with her hand in mine, watching the drip, talking about everything and nothing. She'd asked me once, during one of those sessions, whether I was scared. Of losing you, I said. Every second. She'd squeezed my hand. I need you to pay attention, she said. While I'm dealing with all this, I need you to pay attention to what's happening at home. I hadn't understood her then. I thought she meant the house, the bills, remembering to call the furnace people before winter. It took me a few more months to understand she meant Dennis. It was a small thing that started it. Cheryl had asked to borrow money, $30,000 to help with a renovation, or so she said. I'd said yes, of course, and written a check. 3 weeks later, Dorothy happened to mention it to Cheryl on the phone, asking how the renovation was going. And Cheryl had no idea what she was talking about. The money had gone somewhere else. When I'd asked Cheryl about it directly, she'd gotten flustered, said there'd been a miscommunication, that the renovation plans had changed. I'd let it go because I could see how uncomfortable she was, and I didn't want to push her. But Dorothy hadn't let it go. That was the difference between us. She'd smiled and changed the subject on the phone with Cheryl, and then that evening she'd said to me, I want to call Hugh tomorrow. About what? About protecting what we built, she said. Just in case. I should have pushed her on what she meant by just in case. I should have asked more questions. But she was in treatment, and I was afraid of adding to her burden. So I just said, all right. And she'd made the call the next morning while I was shoveling the driveway. She never told me exactly what she'd arranged. She said only that she'd tidied things up and that she didn't want me to worry about it. I trusted her. I always trusted her. 41 years of marriage, and she had never once given me a reason not to. Standing in Hugh's office that morning, looking at her signature, I understood. She had known she might not be around to protect what we'd spent our whole lives building, so she'd done it herself, quietly, in the middle of her own illness, because that was the kind of woman Dorothy was. The weeks after the meeting were difficult. Cheryl stopped calling. Dennis sent a single email to my address, CC'd to a lawyer I didn't recognize, with the subject line clarification on estate assets, which Hugh told me to ignore, which I did. I ate a lot of soup. I watched television without taking any of it in. I went to the grocery store and stood in the produce section for 10 minutes unable to decide between two types of apple, and then I left without buying anything and sat in my car in the Loblaws parking lot and cried for the first time since Dorothy's service. Not about the money. About the apples. About the fact that Dorothy had always been the one who knew which type to get. Our neighbor across the street, a woman named Beverly, who had been friends with Dorothy since their book club days, started leaving casseroles on the front porch. She never knocked, never made me talk. She'd just leave a dish with a piece of masking tape on the lid with the reheating instructions. I appreciated that more than I can say. One evening in February, I got a call from a number I didn't know. I almost didn't answer. When I did, there was a brief pause, and then a young man's voice said, "Mr. Henderson, it's Jamie. Jamie Ossie. You probably don't remember me." I did remember him. Jamie Ossie had been one of the boys who'd grown up on our street. He and his parents had lived 3 houses down until Jamie was about 12, and then they moved to Mississauga. He was a quiet kid, serious, not many friends his age in the neighborhood. I used to let him sit in my garage when I was working on the car. He'd hand me tools and ask questions. Dorothy had tutored him in math for a full school year, refusing any payment when his parents were going through a hard stretch. "Of course I remember you," I said. He'd tracked down my number through Beverly, he said. He'd heard about Dorothy. He wanted to call and say he was sorry and that he'd thought about her so many times over the years that she was one of the reasons he'd gone into teaching himself. We talked for over an hour. He was 31 now, taught grade 5 at a school in Brampton, was recently engaged to a woman named Adese. He was warm and thoughtful, and talking to him was the first time in weeks that I'd felt like myself. Before we got off the phone, he said something that stayed with me. He said, "She always used to say that a family isn't just the people born into it. It's the people who show up." I held the phone for a long time after we said goodbye. In March, Cheryl came to the house alone. She called first from the driveway and asked if she could come in. I said yes. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table she'd grown up eating breakfast at. And she looked tired in a way that went past the surface. We didn't talk about the will, or the trust, or Dennis. We talked about her mother. She cried. I made tea. At one point, she picked up the photograph from the refrigerator, the one of the 3 of us at Dorothy's retirement party 7 years ago, and she held it for a long time. When she was leaving, standing at the front door with her coat on, she said, "He told me you'd been moving money, that you and Mom had been planning to cut me out." I looked at her. "You know that's not true." She nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I know." She left without saying anything else. But she'd come? That meant something. The trust, as Hugh had explained it, was straightforward in its mechanics. The rental income flowed through correctly. The properties were managed. I hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day, a choice Dorothy had written in her notes as one she'd been intending to suggest before she got sick. I think she knew I was not going to be up for chasing tenants about lease renewals in the first year of grieving her. I also had Dorothy's letter, which Hugh had given me at the end of that first meeting, tucked in a plain white envelope with my name on the front in her handwriting. I hadn't been able to open it for 3 weeks. I carried it around in my jacket pocket for most of that time. I would put my hand in and feel the edge of it when I was sitting in waiting rooms or driving, just to know it was there. I opened it on a Saturday morning in February at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. It was 4 pages in her handwriting, front and back. It started with "My dearest," and it ended with "I love you more than these pages can hold." In between was everything she'd observed, everything she'd feared, everything she'd done to try to protect what we'd built, and, reading between the lines, her hope that Cheryl would eventually find her way back. She had written, near the end, "Don't close the door on her. I know you. You'll want to. Don't. She's our girl. She's just lost right now." I folded the letter back into the envelope and put it in the drawer where I keep the important things. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Ontario, teasing you for weeks before it finally commits. The spruce trees in the backyard came back to themselves. I started going for walks in the evening along the path by the creek. The same path Dorothy and I had walked for years. I started recognizing the same dog walkers, nodded hello, learned a few of their dogs' names. Jamie called again in April. We'd been talking every 2 or 3 weeks by then. He and Adizzy were planning the wedding for the fall, a small ceremony, and he asked, somewhat shyly, whether I would come. He said Dorothy had felt like family to him. He said I did too, if that wasn't strange to say. I told him it wasn't strange at all. In May, Dennis moved out of Cheryl's house. I heard it from Beverly, who had heard it from someone in Cheryl's neighborhood. I didn't call Cheryl right away. I waited a week, and then I called on a Sunday morning, and she answered on the second ring. "I heard," I said. "Yeah." A pause. "It's fine. It's going to be fine." "I know it is." "Dad, I'm sorry. For a lot of things." "You don't have to." "I do, actually. I really do." Her voice was steady. She'd always had Dorothy's steadiness when it mattered. "He told me things. About you and Mom. I should have called you. I should have asked." "You're asking now," I said. She came for dinner the following Saturday. I made chicken and rice, Dorothy's recipe, the one Cheryl had grown up on. She brought wine and a tulip plant for the kitchen. She sat at the table and ate 2 full plates, and we talked the way we used to talk before all of it. About her job, about the neighborhood, about the small stupid things that make up a life. Before she left, she asked about the rental properties. Not in the way Dennis had asked. Not with a suit and a strategy. She asked like a person who wanted to understand, who wanted to know what her mother had put in place and why. I told her. All of it. Dorothy's phone call to Hugh, the trust, the letter. I didn't read her the letter. That was still mine, but I told her what it said. By the time I finished, she had her hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes were bright. "She did all of that," Cheryl said, "while she was sick." "She was always 2 steps ahead," I said. "You know that." In September, I drove to Brampton for Jamie's wedding. Small ceremony, just as he'd said. Maybe 40 people in a community hall that Adizzy's family had decorated beautifully, with yellow and green and a great deal of flowers. Jamie saw me come in and came straight across the room to shake my hand, and then, after a second, pulled me into a hug. "You came," he said. "Of course I came," I said. I sat near the back and watched him get married, with the kind of happiness that is quiet and sure. His mother was there, older than I remembered, and she held my hand during the ceremony without saying anything. Adizzy was radiant. The food afterwards was joyful and abundant, and I ate things I didn't know the names of, and they were wonderful. On the drive home, the 410 North in the early evening with the sky going orange over the highway, I thought about Dorothy. I thought about her saying a family is not just the people born into it. I thought about the letter in my drawer. I thought about Cheryl coming for dinner, about the tulip plants still on the kitchen windowsill, about the way things break apart and the slow, undramatic way they sometimes come back together. The trust is still in place. The properties are managed. The house on Birchwood Drive still has Dorothy's spruce trees in the backyard, and in the winter they still bow under the snow, and I still watch them from the kitchen window. But I'm not holding a cold cup of coffee anymore. I put the kettle on in the mornings, and I know which apples to get, and on Sunday evenings I call my daughter, and she answers. There's a tulip plant on my kitchen windowsill right now. Cheryl brought it the first time she came back for dinner. It's nothing remarkable, just a small green pot with pink blooms. But I water it every morning. And every morning I think about how strange and slow the road back to someone can be. I used to believe that the people who hurt you do it out of some particular cruelty, some deliberate calculation. Dennis was calculated, yes, but what I understand now, looking back at everything that unfolded over those months, is that people who act the way he did are not operating from a position of power. They're operating from fear. Fear that there won't be enough. Fear that they don't deserve what they have without taking more. That kind of fear makes a person ugly in ways they can't even see in themselves. Dorothy saw it before I did. That's the part that still moves me when I sit with it. She was going through chemotherapy, losing her hair, exhausted in a way I had never seen her exhausted, and she was still paying attention, still thinking clearly, still making phone calls to Hugh and sitting down to read trust documents and signing her name on paperwork that she knew I might not find for years. That's not luck. That's a woman who understood that doing right by the people you love sometimes requires you to think carefully and act quietly, even when you have every reason in the world to simply rest. I think about what I could have done differently. Whether I should have confronted Dennis sooner, been more direct, made it harder for him to operate the way he did inside my daughter's life. Maybe, but I also think there's something to be said for the kind of patience that isn't passivity, the kind where you gather yourself, you make sure your foundations are solid, and you trust that the truth has a way of becoming visible in time. Dorothy had that. She passed some of it to Cheryl, even if it took Cheryl a while to find it again. What I've come to believe, quietly, over this past year of walking the creek path and eating Beverly's casseroles and talking to Jamie on the phone, is this. A person's character is not just what they do when things are going well. It's what they hold on to when things fall apart. Integrity isn't a value you declare. It's a practice. It's Dorothy calling Hugh from the kitchen while I was shoveling the driveway. Not because she wanted to win anything, but because she wanted to make sure the people she loved would still be protected after she was gone. And resilience, the real kind, not the kind that gets put on coffee mugs, isn't about not being knocked down. It's about what you do in the weeks when you can't choose between two types of apple in a grocery store. It's about answering the phone when a number you don't recognize calls on a February evening. It's about sitting across from your daughter at a kitchen table that holds 30 years of breakfasts and letting her say she's sorry without making her earn it. Jamie said Dorothy used to say that a family is the people who show up. I think she was right, and I think showing up requires all three of those things working together. The decency to treat people as they deserve, the wisdom to see clearly even when it's inconvenient, and the steadiness to keep going when the house is quiet and the coffee goes cold. The spruce trees in the backyard are Dorothy's. They were here before the trouble started, and they'll be here long after. Some mornings I stand at the window, and I think that's enough, that it's enough to still be here, still be standing, still have the kettle on. It is enough. It turns out it always was.